new coilovers to arrive, I thought I would go ahead and do a quick Coilovers 101 video for those that aren't familiar with them. Alright, hopefully you can read it now. So, why coilovers? Well, obviously, it's the adjustability. With coilovers, you can adjust the ride height, you can raise and lower it multiple times, not a problem. Adjust it to whatever ride height you want at the time. There's some work involved, but you can change it. The ride quality, that is the stiffness or the softness of the ride. So if you're going to go to the track, you're going to want to stiffen it up. Don't over stiffen it. Whereas if you're just driving down, you're going to take a drive down the interstate, go on a trip, you can soften it up so that your wife doesn't complain the whole time. You can also just preload. We'll talk about preload when we get to springs. One thing, when you get coilovers, generally speaking, if it's a reputable company and they know what they're doing, your springs should match the shocks or the dampers. People will buy new springs, lowering springs, and throw them on the stock dampers, and then the ride isn't so good. Well, quite often they've gotten springs that are way too stiff and the dampers can't control them. Well, and it could be the other way, but either way, they've got to match. They've got to match with coilovers as well. But generally, coilovers, if you get a good, well-designed coilover, you should be pretty close. Coilovers can control dive. That's where you hit the brakes, the front end drops. The back end actually comes up a little too, but the front end drops. That's dive. Squat, it's just the opposite. Get on the gas, that back end sits down, it squats, and it's a lot of body movement. And then you have body roll or sway. Now, springs and coilovers do help control sway. However, if all you want to do is control your sway, anti-sway bars. I have anti-sway bars on my RF Miata. It's a club, and it took that sway out very nicely. Now, it didn't lower it. It didn't stiffen the ride. It just removed the sway. Well, I've decided to get some coilovers because I want to lower it and I want to be able to play with it and might take it to some track days. Let's do the dampers or shock absorbers. What these do is they control the speed that a spring can expand and compress. So a spring will hold a certain amount of weight at a certain level. It doesn't care about speed. When things change, when more weight's thrown on it, that spring's going to drop. If less weight is put on it, that spring's going to expand, and it's going to do it as fast as it can. It does not control, it doesn't care about its speed. That's not what it's designed for. Dampers control how fast that spring can expand. So when you hit a dip or a pothole, the wheels go down, they expand, or compress. So you hit a bump and the spring wants to come up. The dampers control that. That's what your stiff and your soft settings do. How fast that spring is allowed to move. Most coilovers are a single controlled monotube. Not all. There are 2s and 3 controlled coilovers. There's twin tubes and others. But most are going to be a single controlled monotube. And when I say single control, there's one dial that you can adjust. It affects both the expansion and the compression of the spring. Now, while we're talking about the control setting, most shocks use a needle and seat valve. Needle and seat valves are the same thing you would see in carbs. Now, this may be too old school for some of you. Some of you have never played with a carburetor. But that's how you'd control the fuel mixture on a carburetor. This is kind of how it looks here. And when you screw this in, that needle will fill the hole. That means nothing's flowing. So it's closed. That would obviously be the most stiff. As you start backing that out, it allows more fluid to pass. And in the case of a damper, it allows the spring to move faster because the fluid can move through there quicker. So always adjust the dampener setting from full hard, that is with this closed. That way you're consistent. Now let's move on to the springs. Let's see if I can explain this graph. Over here on the left side, we have the weight, that is the spring, the weight of that spring. It represents how much weight is being put on the spring. Over here, we have the millimeters, the length of travel of the spring. So we have 10 mil, 20 mil, etc. And with a linear spring, it's going to go in a straight line from zero compression all the way up to full compression. And these would continue theoretically until you hit either coil bind. I didn't write it. Coil bind, that is where the coil is completely compressed, or the shock length, the full extension of the shock hits. Hopefully you've got bump stops to slow it down. But it's a straight line. Progressive shocks, or springs, sorry. Progressive springs would come like this, and they're real soft for small bumps. So, you know, and then it stiffens up, and in the sports world, racing, you don't use progressive springs. They're for comfort. You want predictability. So if this is a coilover, there's your spring, and you have a seat here and a seat here. One of these is adjustable. The full amount from seat to seat, in other words, the length of that coil or spring, your free length is the uninstalled length, the max length of the spring, and preload affects this. Preload. If the free length, or it's at full extension, here to here, when I start adjusting this seat in, compressing the spring, that is called preload. Preload moves the starting point of the length line, that's this line, so it's a linear spring. I have started compressing it. Let's say I do 10 mil of preload. I have, in effect, the way I'm going to draw it is, I'm going to move this line here. My pen doesn't want to write. It's in effect, now the coil, the spring, is already at this spot. So for weight purposes, I now have a weight on that spring, and a 10 mil 7 kilogram, if I preload 10 millimeters and it's a 7 kilogram spring, 10 times 7 is 70. I now have 70 kilograms without ever putting any vehicle weight on the coilover. That is preload. It moves the starting point of the length of the line. So I could, if I could pick this line up, or either line, and move them over 10, that would also be correct. So let's just show. Preload. You're always going to have some preload to hold that spring so there's no play in it. But as a general rule, you want to try to use the minimum preload required and to maximize the extension of the shock. However, we're not getting into tuning. This is 101. Preload raises the height of the vehicle at the expense of travel. When you add preload, so if you move this in, you are in effect raising it's going to raise the vehicle. So if your coilover has a height adjustment and you add preload, you want to back your height adjustment up. It is not always 1-to-1, but sometimes it is. Depending on your coilovers, there's actually a ratio that, depending on the coilovers, that you would need to use. Does not change spring rate on linear spring. So again, it's a linear spring. All we've done was compressed it 10 mil, which is added, in this case, 70 kilograms of weight to the spring, and that is where it starts. When you go to compress it past 10 mil, it's still compressing at the same 7 kilograms per millimeter. And I hope I did my math right. I just did my head real quick. And again, as we said, preload removes spring play. You don't want the spring bouncing in there. If your spring is not long enough, if it doesn't fill the entire space between the two seats when they're in the settings that you want, that's when you need helper springs. They take care of your negative preload. So use to control spring play if spring is shorter than the shock at full extension. So if you need more extension than your spring can handle, you put what's called a helper spring. Helper springs are very light. Free sag. So as you know, a car is going to settle, or a bike or a truck, whatever, when you put the vehicle on the ground with your new coilovers. There's going to be compression. Well, free sag is the settled height under vehicle's weight from full extension. That is how you measure it. So if your shocks, let's say, were, just make it easy, 100 millimeters, and that's when they're extended. When you set the weight of the vehicle on to those shocks on the wheels, the springs, it's going to compress them a given amount. So that's free sag is the vehicle's weight, and it's actually the measurement from full extension to where it sets with just the vehicle. So that's going to be, let's say it compressed 39 mil. That's right here at 7 on the 7K springs. And these, by the way, are some really rough numbers on the Miata. And on the rear, that my math said 60 mil. That's right there. So just by our free sag, 60 mil and 39 mil. That's just the vehicle's weight on the shocks. And again, this is very rough numbers. ND Miata, roughly 2,400 pounds, 50-50 front to back, 1,200 pounds each, 50-50 side to side, 600 pounds per wheel. Yes, I didn't calculate unsprung weight, and I used very rough numbers. But for the front, if you're looking at 600 pounds, is same as 272 kilograms, which based on a 7K spring is 39 millimeters of sag. Same with the rear. The rear is a 4.5, so your multiplier is different, but it ends up being roughly 60 millimeters of free sag. So I did my math right. Now you add driver. Okay, hold on. Static sag. Some you may have heard of race sag. Well, that's with the driver and passenger and anything else you've added to the car to free sag. So, so that's what we're looking at here. Add the driver who's setting in the back. So a driver in a Miata is mostly in the back wheels. Most of that weight, not all of it. And it tends to be towards one side than the other. But that's one of the reasons you'll see people, Miatas with a rake, the back end a little higher than the front, is because that added weight, so I'm 170 pounds, that's 77 kilograms, mostly in the rear. Now, it's not all on that one shock. It's actually across 3 shocks, 2 on the side and then the other additional rear one. But I'm going to guess roughly 10 mil additional sag between your free sag and your static sag on the back shocks. So you're now looking at from 60, you're possibly at 70. That's why you generally have that rake, because when the person gets in it, that back end is going to drop, in my case, about 10 millimeters. So that's your static sag. Droop travel. Static sag equals your droop travel. Droop travel, how far the spring can extend from static sag. Droop being dropped. It's dropping. So some is required, and preload affects this. We'll talk about that. Helps keep tire on the road in dips and potholes. That's for grip. You're going around a curve, you're taking a turn, there's a dip or there's a pothole. If your wheels can't drop, if you don't have enough drop travel, they're going to be in the air for some time, and your tires aren't going to be gripping the road. You're going to slide. You've got to have some droop travel. Preload affects this because we have artificially shortened the length of the spring can travel. So we started with 10, we've already said on the back, let's say we're now at 70 on static sag. Let's say I had done 40 preload. Well, I have just shortened from here to here is now my droop travel. My wheels can in this case the rear tires can only drop 30 millimeters. I don't know if you've seen some potholes, but there's some big potholes. It's much better if they're here. We're not getting into tuning, so the quality of what that all affects on your ride quality and everything, we're not going to talk about. Droop travel, we talked about that. Bump travel is the opposite pretty much of droop travel. So when you hit a bump, how far the spring can extend from static sag. Everything's based on static sag because hopefully if you're not in the car, it's not moving. It is how well the shock can absorb bumps. and that's affected by the bump travel number, which I don't have anything written here. Let's theoretically, let's say 100 millimeters is that our theoretical shock length that we talked about. Let's say we're at 70 static sag. Guess what? 30 mil. We have 30 mil travel for bump. So if the bump is bigger than 30 millimeters, we're going to bottom out the shock, the spring, and the car itself is going to take the rest of that hit, including us. So you want long is good. Again, we're not talking about tuning, so there's pros and cons. Everything, it's all balanced. It's a big, complicated system when you start talking tuning. And we covered free length, uninstalled length. So in other words, the farthest that this extends. When it comes to an ND Miata, the RF has slightly more weight in the back. That's why if you buy like coilovers and they suggest doing for RF, say add 10 mil of preload on an RF, that's because there's slightly more weight, and we get back to sag. We have now, the back end is going to be raised just a little bit, 10 mil. On the RF, it's going to have just that little more weight because this is linear. We're now at 70 kilograms already on there. So it raises that back end of the RF just enough to make up for that additional weight. And I say that it raises it theoretically via the spring. It's holding it up, whereas it would not have been holding that up without that preload. Anyway, I hope that that was somewhat helpful. Again, I'm trying to keep this very basic with coilovers 101. Yes, you can get very deep in this subject, way deeper than I can possibly go. So if you're looking at buying some coilovers, there's some numbers, some stuff that hopefully will be useful. If so, please like, subscribe, comment, and good luck with yours.